Hey everyone, good morning. We'll go ahead and get started here. Hi everyone, my name's Michaela Sample. Hopefully you saw me on our last call when Anna introduced me, but I'll be helping take over the programming for these deep dives calls. I'm very excited to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Suresh Venkatsubrahmanian from Brown University, here to speak on his report, Strategies for Integrating AI into State and Local Government Decision-Making. Hopefully all of you have had a chance to read it. And if not, Dr. Suresh is prepared to give a little presentation. And we're really hoping for a lot of Q&A today, a lot of discussion back and forth. I'll let him speak for himself, but I know he's very interested to hear the transportation perspective and tailor his answers to your specific needs. So with that, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much. I hope you all can hear me fine.
Yes.
Great. So thank you all for joining, and I'm really excited to get a chance to talk to you. Like Michaela said, I'd love to have this be a conversation rather than a drone, like me just droning on. So I'll try to do a little bit of high-level summary of the report, which I don't expect all of you have read, but I think it might be helpful. I also spent a good amount of time, or at least some amount of time, reading the strategic plan for transport AI and transportation in Texas, which I really enjoyed reading. So for those of you who are involved in writing it, I really appreciate the work you put in, and I hope I can tailor our discussion to things that you're doing in that realm. I should say I know nothing about transportation, so I'm eager to learn from you all. I do know a bit about AI, and maybe that's where I should start with my background. I'm a computer scientist by training. I've been working in, broadly speaking, the area of AI governance. At least that's what we call it now. When I started working on it, we were. Oh, there's a question about the report. Let me just see if I can quickly get you a link to the report itself.
I can send the link in the chat. Don't worry about it.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you. I've been working in this area that we now call AI governance in 2025, but I guess when I started working on it, it was really talking about machine learning and what happens when we deploy machine learning in the world in high impact settings that affect people's lives. I think I cut my teeth on pre-trial risk assessments in the criminal justice system, which is, as you can imagine, is a very high risk, high impact setting. But as over the years, and I've been doing this for over a decade now, over the years, we realized that the questions coming up when you deploy what we then called machine learning, and now we're calling AI systems out in the world, were many-fold and sort of varied, and they involved, yes, issues of bias, but also issues of transparency, accountability, validity, checking, governance, all the questions I think people are talking about right now. And so because of the research I did, I also been involved in various policy spaces. I started off working with cities, so with New York City and with Philadelphia, thinking through how they could build out risk assessment tools. I worked with the state of Utah, where I was living at the time, helping guide them on their procurement policies around AI systems. And then in the last administration, in the Biden administration, I worked in the White House at the Office of Science and Technology Policy, helping draft and guide AI policy at that level, including developing and being one of the co-authors of the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. Again, something that has been an important document in sort of guiding how states and localities have been thinking about AI governance in their own world. I work closely with the folks at NIST, who developed the risk management framework, which I know is a thing that people have studied a lot, and I know that your system is modeled on as well. And ever since I came back to Brown, I've been, I direct a center at Brown called the Center for Tech Responsibility, and we've been thinking broadly about, what it means to do AI governance in this era, especially in an era of ChatGPT, of generative AI, and how that changes and does not change the kinds of concerns we have when we put AI systems out in the world. And so, I continue to do policy work as well as sort of just core research in computer science and evaluating Gen AI systems. And so that's where I am. And so this summer, I worked with the national academies to co-author a report on how state and local governments can adopt and incorporate AI in sort of careful and thoughtful ways into their own work. And that report is what has been linked in the chat. And I think that's how I was connected with your team, folks who attended the webinar that we did in August on this report. So it's fairly recent, and then invited me to come and talk to you all. So what I thought I'd do maybe is spend a few minutes giving you kind of the high level, the TLDR of the report, if you wish. And again, you don't have to have read it ahead of time. But I will say that I think it should be very much in alignment with what you all are doing in your own world. Having read the strategic AI plan that you have, I think there's a lot that's very, very in line with that. So I don't think anything that I say will be particularly surprising to you. And then once I've done that very brief high-level summary, I'm really eager to have a conversation with you about what challenges you're facing. As in, with my academic hat on, I'm really interested in understanding how people on the ground are experiencing and dealing with AI and what concerns are coming up as a way to guide what kind of questions we should be trying to investigate rather than, us sitting in our offices and deciding what questions we should be studying. So with that, let me just jump in. So you have the link to the report, and I think the executive summary pretty much says everything you need to say if you want to do it. But I think the goal of writing this report really was to collect together and synthesize a lot of understanding that had already come out from groups like yourselves and other groups and from broader intergovernmental coalitions, for example, the GovAI coalition of cities across the country led by San Jose, on how to think about careful, thoughtful, trustworthy, valid deployments of AI systems in different settings. And of course, another thing I will commend your report on is that AI is many things. It's not just one thing. There's machine learning, there's decision-making systems, there's computer vision tools, robotics, generative AI, and they're all very different. It's convenient sometimes to lump them all together under the phrase AI, but it's also not helpful sometimes because the specifics of the tools and the specifics of the systems you're using matter. And so I think one of the reasons why this report was important to write was to say, there's a lot of understanding right now of how to do this well. It doesn't mean like move fast and break things. It doesn't mean sit back and avoid it. It just means be careful and thoughtful. And so there's a kind of almost a systematic process for doing this. And if we summarize this in stages. Like the first stage is how to think about the foundations and like why should we be using AI and how do we use it in a responsible way? And we call it sort of foundations and governance. And some of the key points are, again, like I said, are points that are probably not surprising to folks in this group, but it's really focus on, purpose, focus on what people want, rather than, as often happens when vendors bring a tool in, here's a tool, let's figure out how to use the tool, right? Because by focusing on purpose and people, you automatically start asking the right kinds of questions about whether the tools that you're thinking of using are going to be helpful to you or not, and how they might be helpful. There's this important element of engaging the public. I think, one of the challenges with a lot of AI tools is that they come in a kind of cookie cutter, like a wrap box, and they claim to be general purpose and apply across the board. But really, if you engage
at least
the
you have
public,
the shade at night.
Sorry, I don't know if that was a question, but if you engage the public at all aspects of the design process and aspects of the deployment and evaluation process, you get far more meaningful assessments of whether the tools are working well for you and how they can work well for you than if you did not do that. And that's hard. It's not quick. It's not cheap, but it's important, and it'll ensure that the tools you use have lasting effect. And then there's this idea of doing things proportionally. We don't have to jump in head first. We don't have to sit back and wait for everything to be perfect. No one is, I think, recommending that. But the idea of being adaptive and iterative, and I'll come back to this point later on, deploying, measuring, checking how things are going, changing course as needed, and so on. Just being dynamic about it is the best way to use these tools. Another important aspect, I think, and which you all are doing already, is building collaborative frameworks, right? There are sort of state-level frameworks or state-level collaborative groupings of people sharing knowledge. There's groupings in the city. Your group itself is a collaborative network of folks thinking about transportation across the state of Texas. And so I think those networks are very helpful because they, again, provide on-the-ground feedback and experience as to what's happening, what deployments actually look like, and what we have learned from them. And I feel like just coming from the academic side of this, from the high level where we talk about AI broadly, this kind of knowledge is invaluable. Learning what's happening on the ground is very, very helpful to understand how we should be designing, deploying, evaluating the systems we put out. Another thing that I want to focus on is sort of, again, the design process. Again, aligning the problem definition with context and goals is very important. It's not, have hammer will find nail. It's more like, okay, do we in fact have nails? Do we have screws? Do we have rails? Do we have tracks? What do we need for that? Just even asking that simple question leads to much better answers and much more effective solutions than not doing that. Which also means defining proper evaluation criteria, establishing feedback mechanisms. And one of the sort of secrets of AI evaluation right now, especially for generative AI systems, is that they're very high level, they're very broad, and they're kind of very designed to create the impression of a race where only one can win. In reality, though, evaluations need to be much more sophisticated, much more targeted, much more directed, much more domain specific than they are. And the more we can do that, the better for us. I think that's something that we at Brown are pushing quite a bit in our own work, doing very targeted, context-specific evaluations, which you don't really see in the computer science side of the world, but need more of. And so that's again where on-the-ground evaluations are very important. And the thing you talk about in your report that we also talk about is building capabilities and culture, building internal capacity, doing training, doing all kinds of things that we need to make sure that people who are in the field doing the work have the skills and the resources they need to evaluate these systems well. And then finally, having kind of ongoing adaptive accountability engagement. It's not deploy and then forget. It's more like deploy, observe, adapt, shift. Maybe you don't want to use the system anymore. Maybe you want to double down. It's really working well for you in your specific context. But doing that and having advisory and oversight bodies that can do that for you is very important. So that's kind of very high level of all the key elements of the report. And each of these points we drill down into in great detail with examples of how that's been done. But I think maybe this is where I'm happy to stop and sort of just open up for discussion if people have any questions or people have any thoughts or comments to share.
Yeah, I'll call on Uday first. You just had a question about the Turing test. Would you like to elaborate on that? Give them a moment.
Oh, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, I was just listening to the evaluation. So the light bulb that went off in my head was the so-called Turing test, which I think, if I understand correctly, is that if a ordinary person cannot distinguish whether they're interacting with a human or a machine, then it passes, right? I mean, that could be one evaluation. I know you're talking about very broadly the governance and all that, but I just wanted to chime in and mention that. And the second comment I had was, our biggest problem, at least I can speak for traffic operations, is data, and it's almost never good enough or timely enough to make even non-intelligent decisions.
Right.
And so, how the governance or whatever framework needs to, or funding or whatever needs to focus on that. That is your foundation. Without that, you have, at least in operations, you have nothing. If you don't know what is going on there, then to build that into, say, you start with, as an example, logs of a system that is down to like a time series. Then you build that up into a database that you can query.
Right.
Then you can build that database that you can query into something that can answer smart questions at will, that can then be passed the Turing test, and so on.
Yep. I mean, these are great points, and maybe I'll take them one by one. I think your first point about the Turing test, and for those who are maybe not as familiar, the Turing test was proposed by Alan Turing in a famous paper from 1950, talking about what it might mean to build a machine that can exhibit intelligent sort of behavior. And as they mentioned, the idea being that you have a test where you have a human behind a console at one and a machine behind a console the other, and you can interact them just through text typing. Think of it like a chat GPT in 1950, right? And then you see if you can tell the difference. The Turing test has been the source of a lot of debate and discussion within the computer science and the AI community about whether it actually represents a useful test of effectiveness of a system in practice. And I was looking at the set of use cases in your report, all the different, I think there are 18 of them, or maybe more, 30 use cases you have in your report, in your strategic plan for AI. I would say that for none of them. Is the Turing test the right test to apply to see if your AI system is going to be useful? You have much more specific goals, and I think the report actually talks about this. What specific things you need to do to assess whether, for example, you have a system that's very good at predicting, hotspots or where crashes are going to happen, right? You can build actual evaluations for that, and you should do that. And you need, as they mentioned, very good data to do that, and that's what you should be doing. And I will say that you are correct, and I think I appreciate that your report talks about this data being sort of a foundation and a future sort of goal for what you want to do. Is that without data you have nothing. And even though we are currently in a place where it seems like a chatbot can answer all kinds of questions about everything, I would invite you, if you haven't already, to ask it questions about areas that you have expertise on and see how good the answers are. It's very, I think, we all like to use the chatbots in various ways for various purposes. And I think we've all, asked the various questions. The minute I've had to ask it a question about something that I know something about, I found that the answers are like, kind of so-so. If I'm a professor, I would give it like a B minus or C plus. I'm an Ivy League, so we get higher grades for everything. But like a C grade for things. It's not terrible, but it's not that particularly good either. But that's only because I know the area I'm talking about. So I think, I would encourage you to do that, especially with the Gen AI systems. But I think a lot of the cases you talk about in your report require very specific machine learning tools for doing prediction, for doing decision making or decision assistance that are probably better off being built customized and specific to your needs with the right kind of data versus using something generic and hoping it does well for you.
Michaela, I have a question, and then I see a couple in the chat too. But this is Anna McCauley. I'm at CTR with Michaela. I'm at the university, but we work closely with both the state DOT, who's probably half of this call, and then also local government, so cities and counties and MPOs and transit authorities. The question that I have for you, well, I've got a couple, but the first one is, in y'all's research, I think transportation and agency work generally is interesting because there are a mix of use cases. Some are like kind of institutional, HR related and kind of procedural. And those are oftentimes lower risk. And, you can play around and see how things are going, scanning in documents and reading documents, that sort of thing. But there's a whole other bucket of use cases that you must have seen also in TxDOT's AI strategic plan that are like operational and sometimes safety critical. So some of those there should be a human in the loop and a human checking on. I think oftentimes it's called like decision support. In your work, did y'all find or establish like thresholds or recommendations for how to understand if this is a use case where there should be a human in the loop and it should be decision support versus totally automated start to finish?
Right. And it's funny you mentioned that, because when I was looking at your case studies, the case studies I was writing down in my notes, there's sensing, there's optimization, there's decision making and planning, there's analysis, like post analysis, and there's automation. And you're right, these are all very different in salience and level of risk and level of concerns, and they should be treated as such, not as one thing. In terms of what our research tells us, I think one thing that we have found to be useful, and I know that your report has used as well, is the NIST risk management framework, right? Because it forces you to ask a number of questions about the system you're deploying and developing that will then allow you to understand the level of risk, the level of human in the loop sort of intervention required and oversight and monitoring required, and to the extent to which what kind of data you need and so on, right? So I think I would say, as a heuristic, I would say any kind of place where you're doing decision support for decisions that people have been making about complex situations, whether it's, for example, doing fraud detection, which I think was one of your, I think item Y in your list was about AI-driven fraud and threat detection and things like that, and things about there were some items about perhaps deciding on contracts or deciding other strategies for risk management. These are places where these are complex, these are involve a lot, they're socio-technical systems, and you would want humans to be governing and running the systems. A lot of yours are much more sort of on the ground monitoring, right? So infrastructure analysis or There's one on traffic flow management and hotspot mitigation. These are much more sensor driven. And I think you could argue that you need less human intervention, but you need reliable data to build predictive models for these as well. And so that I think so. While I wouldn't say that there is a clear demarcation, and I think you all will know much better. It sounds like you already have this sense that certain domains are more, and I would say roughly the more socio-technical, the more human involved, the more complex the spaces, the more likely it is you're going to need people governing what these systems can do because they're not good at that level of nuance.
That's good info. Thank you.
Right. And then we had another question in the chat from Matt Miller. I can read it off, but Matt, if you want to follow up. So are there frameworks within disciplines particularly applicable to AI deployments, such as systems engineering and the V diagram?
So I don't know what the V diagram is or systems engineering. I will say that one of the challenges on our side, on the sort of side of academic research and sort of some amount of industry research and AI work is that it has been very experimental, I would say, not even empirical, experimental, and sort of, build something, throw it out and cross your fingers, hope for the best. What we don't yet have are solid engineering practices that go into the deployments. And that's something that people are beginning to talk about. There's this whole area of ML engineering and systems engineering that, as you mentioned, that is coming into this, but we don't have systematic processes yet. Because at least traditionally ML has been very much a build something and throw it out kind of discipline rather than a be very careful and do solid engineering work kind of discipline. And that's something that does need to change and has been slowly changing. But I think it only changes when there's a sense that we should be careful about what we put out there and make sure it does what we want it to do, right? I was talking to a reporter today morning about these friend.com bracelets. I don't know if you've heard of them. It's a new thing. It's basically a pendant with a little chat on it. It listens to everything you say and is your friend. And, there are lots of implications for what it means for our ability to connect with people, connect with society, connect with each other. There's a proper engineering approach to spend some time thinking about that. But this company just put this out there, and now we have to deal with the consequences. So that's unfortunately how a lot of AI deployments go.
Thank you. We have another question from the chat from Amanda. I think the AI is less of a concern, and the main focus should be teaching people how to use the AI. There are situations where people just take data at face value and don't understand the full situation. Have AI thought about disclaimers to encourage critical thinking?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I think one version of this question is how do we make sure that the systems we use, whether they're ML predictive systems or Gen AI chatbot-like systems, accurately express uncertainty, right, about the quality of the answers that are being given, so that people can get a better sense of, okay, this chatbot is saying this thing, but it's not really sure about it, right? I mean, so that's one way people have tried to approach this. Not successfully yet. I think the problem with chatbots is that they're very sure about things that even if they're not sure about, like kind of like my students sometimes. So, but that's one mistake. I think but your broader point, you're right that there is this thing called automation bias, where people tend to assume that things coming out of a machine or things that have numbers attached to them are automatically correct just because numbers look correct all the time. And that's something that there's a whole dimension to work in AI, which is about, the human-computer interaction part of it. How do we present information in a way that correctly captures what we know and don't know and what we're sure about and not sure about? Do we have clean answers? Unfortunately, as this is going to be a theme in my responses, no simple answer to this. Every domain is different. But even something as simple as you're building some estimate and you include the probability of the uncertainty estimates around that is something that's sort of a natural thing that you would do that we need to do more of when we use AI. And we need to keep remembering that these tools exhibit certainty without necessarily having certainty.
All right. And Darren, I see you have your hand raised if you'd like to ask a question.
Thanks. It's actually kind of a emphasis, and thank you, sir. I mean, you're really hitting key points of our strategy, and our CIO Ellison and myself were overall responsible for the delivery of the AI strategy for the department.
It's a great report. I really want to. I'm not just saying that because I'm talking to you all. It was really. I read a lot of these reports, and a lot of them are very blah blah blah. This one is not.
Thank you. You made two key points, and I wanted to reemphasize them. come back to the idea of validation. But certainly our approach has been at least certainly for now with AI and its level of development, that we want human in loop, regardless if that's at the end of a decision process or directly involved in the decision as it's developed. I think in some cases the automation, certainly robotic process automation gets confused for AI. So we're much more approving and supportive of inserting RPA into a number of our processes and just letting that run once it's proven that it does what it's supposed to do, because there's no real thinking involved in that. Whereas if I added a layer of machine learning on top of that, where the AI begins to learn from some of the things that it's processing, then we still feel we have to have somebody on the back end that's validating that regularly to make sure that it's not wandering, that it's also producing the results we want. And that's kind of been our approach, which is still well short of Gen AI and applications there that we might want to use. So that's one thought. And I think that's in alignment with what you were saying. And then I love the part about the validation. We had a discussion with Deloitte, maybe just last week, about trust scoring of some AI agent processes and the ability to develop that over time. And related to that, we've also had some discussions about a pool fund study to do very advanced future Gen AI use for engineering activities, and the amount of benchmarking that would have to be developed to support that. And I think all those kind of fall in the same spectrum. So it's great to hear that you guys are supporting that type of scoring as well.
Yeah, no, that all makes total sense. And I really appreciate the sort of careful and thoughtful way you've outlined of, not reflexively adopting or not adopting, but sort of approaching it as what you need and what you think in your judgment is sort of an appropriate use, and how to carefully validate it. I think, if we think of AI as the Wild West and chatbots as the Wilder West, then agents are the Wildest West in the sense that they're very new. We know very little about how they work and how to validate them, and it's even more sort of a cutting edge phenomenon, or sort of on the extreme edge phenomenon, than many of the other sort of dare I say more established LLM type tools out there. So yes, I think doing this validation is important. Building the validation framework is important, and I will say that this may or may not be of concern or of interest to you all, but I think one of the things that I have seen is that having insights from the ground, from the field, of groups like yourselves doing this work and putting out, this is how we evaluated systems in our thing, this is what we had to do, this is what we had to check, is actually a very valuable knowledge to share with other groups across the country, and even the broader sort of community of researchers and practitioners thinking about this as well. Because this is a drum I've been beating for a while. I'll probably beat it 3 more times before this talk is over, right? But community-driven evaluation, community-focused evaluation is far more meaningful and far more useful to understand where and how to deploy AI systems than high-level, benchmarks, and someone does a benchmark and gets a score and says, "Yay, we won! Our LLM is the best on this benchmark for reasoning or for thinking or for the Turing test or pick your favorite sort of test you want," right? Those are not helpful. The kinds of things you all are doing, to the extent that you're able to talk about them and share them with the world, is going to be far more useful. And I can say that because in the pre-Gen AI world, when ML systems were being used for decision support, these things would happen from time to time, and they were immensely useful at shaping and governing the discussion on where and how to use them. So I would encourage you to do these tests, not use your own judgment, and then if you can, and it's possible to do so, talk about it in ways that others can learn from as well.
All right, thank you. We have another question in the chat from Mukesh. Could you discuss how does one approach putting safeguards for ill-defined questions, complex questions instead of complicated questions, where AI is more likely to further cement the current understanding that might already be rather poor?
Oof, that's a big question, right? I think it starts with having some clarity on what exactly you're trying to do, right? So for example, I'll just take a hypothetical here, and I'm only picking on this one example because it just comes to mind. I'm going to look at the, let's see, there was one, I have to look at my notes. Give me a quick second. I had a note on one of the early examples that you had, like, okay, this is a very good case study for how to be careful about this. Let's see. Sorry, I should have been better prepared for this. Oh yeah, so there was this item D, which is objective bid item estimation, optimizing project analysis with AI insights, right? So there was a line there. So one of the challenges that project cost and timeline projections are susceptible to fluctuations, variances, and the third item is about, sorry, the second item is about intelligent bid comparison vendor selection, right? As a procurement officer. And by the way, I really love the fact that you said, as a procurement officer, I want something, or as a project manager, I want something, because what it does is it focuses on the person who is involved in the decision making and what their needs are, which is again part of what the report says. We should be people and purpose focused. And that's exactly what these examples do. It's not like someone wants a tool. It's like, no, I'm a procurement officer. I want the tool. So I get to be the one to decide whether the tool is working for me or not, right? So anyway, so that digression aside, I want an AI tool that compares vendor bids, evaluates their terms, and recommends the best vendor based on factors. Right. So here's where my alarm bells go. Okay, you're having a tool that's going to recommend the best vendor. What is best? Do you have a good set of criteria for best? When you start using an AI system to do this, how do you know, can you evaluate properly whether it's getting the best? In other words, do you have historical data on the best? Is that historical data, does it have its own biases about what you had considered best in the past? Do you have a way to make sure that you're not just reiterating and amplifying whatever biases you had, especially if you have concerns about what you're doing before? So in that case, right, that thing went off and I said, okay, this is where you have to be careful and put more safeguards in. And one safeguard could be, do you have reliable data already on what was best in the past so you can expect the model to learn from it? If you don't, or if you're not sure, then that should be a warning sign that how is an AI system going to do any better than you then?
All right. Thank you. We have another question in the chat from Patrick. Are there any cities or counties using AI for permitting process and development/platting application reviews? Are there any best practices or implemented tools?
So one of the things about being a professor and especially working in this space where I have to learn a lot of things that I'm constantly being confronted with how little I know, and I have to be okay with it. So I will say I'm not sure I know anything about permitting processes and the application reviews you're referring to, but I will say this. You should look at the GovAI coalition, which is run out of the city of San Jose. And Michaela, I can send a link to that if you don't already have that. It's a really great coalition of cities across the country that are thinking about practices and processes for incorporating AI in their work. They have things like sample templates for procurement guidelines, sample templates for testing and deployment. And they might have something along the lines of what you're talking about here. I don't know if they do, but if they don't, they're a good place to connect with. One of the people from the GovAI coalition was at our webinar in August talking about this, and I'm happy to sort of connect people up to the right people who will know much more about this than I do.
Michaela, I was going to add, that's a great question from Patrick. And Craig, Casper, I see you on. I remember at one point you talked about, or y'all were maybe exploring using AI tools for like land use planning and kind of regional planning. It's been a while. Have y'all made any movement in that area, or am I misremembering? Craig.
No, sorry, can you hear me?
Oh yeah. Yeah, gotcha.
We are still moving into it, and I have to say we're taking a little different approach as opposed to procurement. We're approaching it like we're going to be hiring an intern, but like a Dr. House. And literally imagine that person coming in as an intern. How are you going to have that person, because he's going to be confident even when he doesn't know what he's talking about. So that's sort of how we're approaching our use of it.
That's a funny analogy. I like it. It goes back to what Suresh was saying about AI is going to, the automation bias, like it doesn't present uncertainty or gaps at all.
Right.
That's interesting.
And some of the older tools,
the
ML, just very quickly, some of the older ML tools, especially the ones that are more statistically rigorous, can actually quantify uncertainty in a way that might be useful. The newer stuff, especially the Gen AI stuff, is very bad at this.
One of the things too is who in our office uses it. Not everybody should have an intern because they're not suited to it. Mm-hmm. So making sure you're matching that. And so, yes, we acknowledge that AI is a tool, but we're approaching it like an intern.
Fair
That
enough.
makes sense.
Fair enough.
Right. And thank you, Shelley, for dropping the Gov AI Coalition link in the chat. So we have that now.
Excellent.
Michaela, I have one last question for Suresh. So a lot of the folks on this call are like local. Craig is with the MPO, local and regional governments. TxDOT, our state DOT, and our state government have really good, you've seen the documentation and really good resources around that. And our Department of Information Resources, DIR, has good tools also. But my question for you is, we see this in AI, we see this in all, transportation has a bunch of like these startup-y tech vendors who, like you said earlier, like call, hey, we've got hammers, let's find a nail. For maybe smaller agencies or folks who are still building up internal capacity in this area, what sorts of questions should they be asking to vendors and to private sector solutions? Like, how do you try to suss out if this is a good partner, a bad partner? What should you be asking?
We have, I'm sorry, I'm scrolling frantically through the report to the section on capability and culture, right? Section 4 of our NASM report, which talks about basically, it starts off with, building internal capacity and competency for the folks who know, as you said, who will then can know what questions to ask. It's kind of funny because when as I mentioned, I was working with the state of Utah many years ago, trying to build a set of guidelines for procurement of AI system. That's exactly what we're doing, trying to write out questions. So we had a whole committee of people involving many folks from the government, and we were trying to write down questions that they could use to ask vendors for information, which then the answers to which hopefully would give them some insight as to what they wanted. And I think a lot of this enters into this. A lot of this appears in the form of procurement policy and procurement guidelines, even though that's kind of a later stage in the process, right? When you're actually thinking about a procurement or building a contract. But those questions are still relevant where they say, for example, what kind, can you disclose how your system, what basically at a high level, how your system works, what kind of data it uses, how customizable it is, what do you do with our data that we give you? That questions like that give you some sense. How much have you validated your system on the cases we care about? Are you willing to do pilot studies with us? Some places we're willing to do like a test pilot or a little sandbox experiment to sort of see if it works in your context versus just something cookie cutter. And I know I was talking, who was I talking with? I was talking with one researcher who was looking at some contracting agreements, right? Basically, like do short term, like 2 months, 3 months.
To approve all these agenda items. Now, okay.
They were talking about building out small short term, like 6 weeks or sprints or small experimental sandboxing activities with a vendor. Say, let's try it out and see if it works first. We'll do a very short contract for this first, and then we can see if this works out the way we want to. Then we can talk about a bigger contract. So there are ways to do that kind of discussion with vendors. I think I'm sure I give you a good answer to your question, but I will just say one thing. A lot of times, folks in the position of having to decide on this feel like they don't know enough about the technology and they're at a disadvantage because the vendors know more. I would say that you don't need to know anything about the technology in order to make good decisions about whether to use it. You just need to know whether it makes sense in your use case. And if the vendors are making it sound like that the tech is too smart and you can't really understand it, then that's a warning flag sign already. That they're sort of obfuscating what should. If it's useful for you, it should be able to be explained to you. And if they can't explain it, that's a problem.
That's good perspective. Thank you. I'll try to find, you said that the kind of short list of questions was work in California.
So the GovAI Coalition has, they have they have a template procurement guideline, and some of the questions there might be useful questions even at the early stages. I have a colleague who's been looking at sort of other experimental sandbox approaches where you do a short-term 6-week contract to try something out. I can reach out and try, and see if I can find out more about that as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, and that was happening, I think, at a city, so it may be appropriate for your setting as well. Yeah.
No, that's fantastic. I had a question around the community engagement. It's definitely something that you brought up in the report as being important, bringing in the community to advise on these. AI being kind of an ununderstood subject, a little bit technical in nature. Do you have any best practices for engaging the public in this area?
I think, yeah. So there's different kinds of communities, right? So when I was talking about community-driven evaluation, I meant you all. You're the
Yeah.
community there because you know your domain exquisitely well. You know what you need. And that's one form of community. I think for systems that are, for example, if you're doing traffic monitoring, hotspot identification, presumably you need people with expertise to understand that that's the community of interest. If you're doing something that's going to face the public at some level, then I think it might be helpful to bring the public in. So the question is, how do you engage them? I think there are different forms of engagement. Some engagement is a form of what does the public or the community in this case want? What are their needs? What are their concerns, right? Sometimes there's a disconnect between what the system is providing and what people want, right? A classic example is if, I don't think any teacher in any K through in any sort of high school has ever said, yes, the one thing we need is more tech in the classroom. I think they'll say lots of things that they need. More tech is not always the thing they need, and yet we keep foisting more tech and saying, use it. That's an example of not talking to the community of people who actually are important here, right? And parents and students and so on. That's community. So engaging with the public doesn't mean asking them about the tech per se, but really understanding their needs, their wants, especially for situations they're going to be impacted by the results. And this is both good practice, I think, but it's also a way to understand what the real questions are, what the real problems are. The thing that, as a computer scientist, I feel sometimes people don't understand is that technology is very malleable. It can be adapted to particular goals and needs. It's not just one black box that can only do one thing. But unless we know what we want to use it for, we don't know how to make it malleable, how to shape it for what we want. If we knew what exactly the problem was we're going to solve, we can talk to vendors. Look, you have this tool, it doesn't quite do what we want. We want to do this. Can you make it do that? And then either they'll be able to do it or someone else will be able to do it. But technology itself can be done, it can be built that way. We can build whatever we want. We just have to know what we want. And I think community engagement ultimately boils down to what is it that we actually want? So that we know how to tell those who are building the tech for us, this is what we need, not the thing you happen to be giving us.
Right, that's the problem definition.
Exactly. And I think you talk about that in your report a lot as well. And I think our report, the NASM report, talks about this in great detail, right? Figure out what is it you're trying to solve.
Yep, that's so important. Uday, you had a question earlier in the chat. What are some good tools? I don't know if you want to elaborate that on or if you got it answered earlier.
I think I heard some answers.
Okay.
But tools for me may not make sense to. I mean, there was some. Like I've tried Grok. I've tried to train it, and
you are a brave person, sir.
And it's and everybody's like, no, you're working for Grok 3. Go to Grok 4. I'm like, no, I'm not paying for that out of my pocket, and it just gives me, like you said, Suresh, just junk answers and refuses to learn. Somebody was telling, hey, we treat them like interns. Someday we'll become CEO, but they refuse to even learn. I mean, so I'm like, hey, I just told you this minus this is equal to a delay. And then it again repeats the wrong answer. I don't know what to do then.
Well, I think that's a very interesting example of that they refuse to learn because they're presented as things that, that if there were a person on the other hand, they would, on the other side of that console, they would learn from your conversation. These systems are not built to learn. They learn once. They do a whole lot of training once upon a time, and they're built. Any adaptation they do is because, not to get too technical, there is sort of a stream of words essentially, and the system just keeps making the stream of words longer and longer in order to attempt to react to things that have been said earlier in the conversation. But at some point there's a cutoff, and at that point it just forgets everything that happened before the cutoff point.
Correct.
Right, and that's
exactly correct.
That's how they're built. They're because to make these what they call context windows longer is very expensive. It takes a lot more time. They'll get slower and slower and slower, and so nowadays you can their context window.
It basically just starts to give me wrong answers.
Correct.
Be very polite, and it'll be buttering me up. Oh, you're a great guy, and what an intelligent guy you are.
Just like a good
yeah, and it's like, okay, stop this. After some time, you're like, this is not working at all. And then another thing I had was in the same lane, a lot of these AI vendors are coming in, and they are not building on top of existing engineering. They're just trying to, like you said, reason through stuff in a very generic way and attack it like that. And I would rather they be standing on the shoulders of giants that
Yeah,
have
I have
already solved the problem.
Yeah, a lot of my
And
friends from college they work in IT organizations now, and one of the comments they've had with the difficulty of incorporating, especially Gen AI tools in their workplace, and they've also been getting pressure from their bosses to use more Gen AI, is exactly this point that you have large code bases, you have a lot of infrastructure, you have systems that are already in place. You're not going to rip them apart and replace them. How do you incorporate some new technology into that? That takes work, it takes care, it takes thought, and it's not just a simple, pull out module, throw an AI, magic happens, right? It's not that simple. And I think keeping those considerations in mind as you bring in AI tools, in some places they may be very helpful, right? But depending on your context and your needs, you have to make that judgment.
All right. I think we've got time for one or two more questions. And while folks are thinking of those, I just want to flag that Darren dropped another guide that complements your report into the chat, and we'll be sure to share that with the other links as well after this call.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's a nice report. I mean, well, it looks nice. I will have to read it more carefully, but it looks good. Yeah.
Right.
There's another
And
question from the chat. Check and look at. Should I do that one, Michaela?
sure, yeah, go for it.
Okay. So the question was, is there a problem with considering AI simply as a special case of the general integration of technology and governance? So do you think this is a good question? There have been many who have talked about, the process of the last 15, 20 years of, digitizing government in general, right? I mean, and how we bring digital tools into government. And that's sort of an ongoing process, right? And even in the private sector, it's been an ongoing process. If you look at healthcare, for example, it's only this year that I actually can go online and look at my test reports and so on. It's taken that long for that to happen, even though they've been talking about this for decades. And so the question that is AI just another version of this or something different? I think there's a part of it that is similar, right? So when you talk about, for example, using document processing or doing robotic process automation, or things where you're trying to speed up processes using automation of various kinds, and maybe AI-driven automation, or maybe not. We just RPA is not exact, as was pointed out, it's not exactly AI. I think those are along the continuum of further digitization, right? So how do you bring more digital processes in? So that part is yes. I think AI in decision making is a new breed of thing altogether. It's not new as in 2 years old, it's new as in 10 years old, because that's how long we've been seeing these deployments of AI in decision-making settings show up, whether it's in criminal justice, employment, education, credit scoring, housing. It's all been showing up over the last 10 years. That is quite different, I think. And that's where we really have to think carefully about human loop, governance, feedback loops, continuous monitoring, and all the other things we need to worry about, bias, and other responsibility and trustworthy behaviors. So that's different, and that we need to pay attention to more carefully. And I think that's one of the things that has animated a lot of my work over the past 10 years. Like, this is different. This is not just the same old, automation of process. This is something, because it's fundamentally trying to replace, augment, add on to, pick your favorite word, human judgment, and judgment being the key here. And I think that's where we have to be very careful. So going back to the earlier question from a little while ago about when do we have to be more worried? I think whenever human judgment is involved, that's when we have to be really, our antenna has to go up. Okay, how are we doing this?
All right, thank you for that. I'll give us another minute or so for another question, and then we might move into some final thoughts that you might have. All right, seeing no hands raised, nobody jumping into the chat. Do you have some final parting words you'd like to share with us today?
I think this has been a great conversation. I think you all understand very well what the potential, the opportunities, and the challenges are with these systems. I don't have much to add to that. The thing I will say that I say all the time, especially I feel like as a computer scientist who allegedly knows how these systems work, I emphasize the allegedly part, and where people think, oh, the technology is very sophisticated and very complicated, and only a few elite few can understand it. I would say you understand more than you give yourself credit for. And to the extent that the tech is obscure, that's not on you, that's on the people building the tech. And you'd be surprised how many people who actually build this tech only have a rudimentary understanding of how it works either. And especially the people who come to you, which are probably the sales teams and the marketing teams who probably, I find if you get through and talk to the engineers, you might actually get a better sense of to the possible of what these systems can and cannot do. But I would always say trust your own judgment, trust your instincts. If you're not sure, then hang on to that. Don't be browbeaten into accepting a piece of tech because it's the cool thing and you should like it and you should adopt it. Just be thoughtful. You should adopt things and be excited about technology, but on your terms. And I think as long as you do that, define your problems, what you want, and demand that the tech be built that does what you want, I think you'll be fine and it can be done.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time. This was truly wonderful and very enlightening. Um,
Appreciate the invitation.
yeah, we just have a couple of wrap-up items for announcements. Our next deep dive call will be happening the first Wednesday of November. I believe that's November 5th. We're going to be doing a transportation in rural areas needs roundtable. So please join us for that. As well, we have our next in-person meeting, October 29th. That'll be at the TxDOT Stastny headquarters. We'll be having a emergency response panel and some project showcases as well. Let me make sure I didn't forget anything. I think that's it. I have a couple of reports that I'll be sharing out with folks as well. In addition, the reports that were shared in this chat.
Can I add one last thing, Michaela, if you don't mind?
Of course.
I just remembered you mentioned so one of the items in your list was on sort of crisis management, disaster management, sort of post thing. There is so the National Science Foundation funds AI institutes across the country that sort of do research on various use inspired sort of concerns around use of AI. There's a whole institute devoted to dealing with disaster management, disaster planning, how AI can be helpful, and they work with crisis response teams. They have a whole bunch of groups. I think one, if I'm not mistaken, is in Texas as well. And so they're based out of Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh, but it's a national institute. And I'm happy to, I'm on their advisory board. And so I know that they do a lot of work in the space that might be of use to you all as you think about this in your context. So if you want to make a connection at some point, I can connect you with the folks there.
Yeah, that'd be fantastic. We'd love that.
Yeah.
All right. Well, one last round of applause. Thank you so much for your time, and we
Thank you
will
very much.
see everybody October 29th in person. Bye,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Thank you,
Thanks so
Suresh.
much.